Amazing. So I think
Look at that.
I think we're soon to be on. We're
I think
maybe
we're
on.
on now.
Are we on?
Amazing.
Yeah.
We're on. We're
We're
live and we're
on.
on. Thank you guys so much for joining me for the first panel in the Catalytic Sound Festival. I'm Kim Alpert, and I'm going to introduce you to these three amazing folks that have joined me today: Bonnie Jones, Ben Hall, and John Corbett. I'm going to start with you, Bonnie Jones. You were the first one to show up today, so you get the punctuality award for the panel. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your purpose and practice, and where it is that you are coming in from today.
My name is Bonnie, and also thanks Catalytic, thanks Ken, Kim, John, Ben, Sam, for having me here today. Excited to talk to folks that I admire and respect in the music world, and whoever else is out there twitching in. I don't know if anybody's used that expression yet. Maybe we can coin it here as a verb.
I like it.
Twitching in. So I am calling today from Providence, Rhode Island, where I have just recently moved to from Baltimore, Maryland. So my body is in Providence, but I will say all of my spirit is probably still in Baltimore. Hasn't caught up yet. I am a musician, electronic music, and a poet, and an educator. And I run a nonprofit that teaches electronic music and improvisation.
Awesome. Ben, tell us a little bit about you.
No one's ever asked me about my practice and purpose. I thought you said porpoise. I am also
Either one.
I'm basically all the same things as Bonnie, except without the awesome nonprofit girls thing that I don't do, which makes me feel inadequate. So thanks for doing that, Bonnie. I used to run a gallery here in Detroit called Young World. I ran a performance space for many years called Entropy Studios. Booked a lot of shows over the years. Thinking about booking and creating spaces as a form of community building and social practice, and also gathering kind of intel and data research on different groups who might be interesting, and figured out how to make those better. Especially after being on tour a lot, you play gigs for 8 people, and you know that there's more than 8 people who actually want to have the experience, but don't know how to shape that experience or get that network built. Even though I hate the concept of networking, networks obviously in the rhizomatic sense are super important. So that's a lot of my work. And then alternately, I am also an educator at Bennington College, where I work under a grant that focuses on food security, which is primarily my background and my active municipal, state, and federal lobbying practice.
Amazing. I'm going to come back to that because I've got a lot of food questions for you. John Corbett, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your purpose, practice, and where you are today.
I am broadcasting from beautiful Rogers Park in Chicago, Illinois. My main activity is working as co-owner of Corbett versus Dempsey Gallery here in Chicago. I've been active in the creative and improvised music worlds for many, many years as an organizer, producer, and writer. And so I kind of bridge those two worlds. We present music at the gallery. We have a record label. I've been writing a lot lately. I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute for nearly 30 years, and gave that up in 2015, and that sort of uncorked possibility of writing again, which I hadn't done long form. So suddenly there was a little torrent of books that came out of that, and I had published 4 books in 5 years. I will never, ever think about doing that again, but I did. All about music in one way or another. And so that's really the main stuff that I do. And we've recently organized the archives at the gallery to be much more of a repository for both 20th century Chicago art ephemera and materials, and improvised music ephemera and materials. And so most recently, Paul Litton put his archives with us, which is super exciting. A lot of material to go through and to inventory and to sort of cross-reference with all sorts of other things that we have, in the name of really trying to have a more formalized archive that'll eventually end up at some sort of an institution where it can be studied on an ongoing basis. So
amazing.
that's it.
I'm gonna pass it right back to you, actually, to kind of kick us off, because one of my questions is, and I think as a gallerist and as a kind of musician artist, you fit in that slash space of where the intersection with, you know, art, be it contemporary performance installation, the whole capital A art, and experimental music, how they're, you know, connected, not just, you know, within your sphere, but in like the larger context and dialogue of those practices.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be biographical for a second, just to say, you know, there was a period before we started the gallery that I was booking music. Ken Vandermark and I had a series together at the Empty Bottle here in Chicago for almost a decade, where we were doing a weekly jazz and improvised music series, and we did a festival 9 times. And toward the end of that, in about 2003, 2002, in 2002, I was actually artistic director of the Berlin Jazz Fest, and I began to feel totally exhausted. Like I could not possibly imagine being the last guy at the club at 4 o'clock in the morning, paying people, mostly half or 2/3 of the way drunk. And so I had to figure out some way to roll out of that into another activity. And I began realizing that I had this interest in the history of Chicago art. So the thing for me was, when I made that transition, I thought maybe this is actually a hard transition and I'm gonna be just doing art. And as it turned out, really quickly, it began to be clear that there were so many parallels in terms of activity, in terms of everything, that those two worlds organically fit together. But the one thing that was extraordinary to me was that there were so few people in the audience of serious art fans who knew the depth and the history and the anything about the experimental music traditions, except the most cursory thing. So we had this we always had, when there was a bit of a joke within the art world or within those of us who were into jazz and creative music, that Talking Heads is about as far as most people in the art world got, and they got stuck there in some way. And that was about as far as most of them were willing to go. And so that was a bit of a challenge. That was just something that we saw as an inherent challenge for us to suddenly open up, try to create places, create situations in which people could come see music, hear music in a context that was an art context where they were familiar, they were comfortable. And it's been really interesting to see how those seeds have produced some interesting fruit.
That's amazing.
So I mean, from my standpoint, I still think it still shocks me how little global recognition in terms of the global art community, the experimental and improvised music traditions have, as they certainly have not risen to the level that they ought to be within the bigger art world cognoscenti.
So interesting. Ben, Bonnie, do you guys have any thoughts about that from a kind of the broader sense and within your practices as well, living in both of those worlds?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I also, a lot of my work in Baltimore, sort of similar to probably both Ben and John, was curatorial and organizing. So in the 20 odd some years that I was in Baltimore, I ran three festivals, music festival, like the improvised music festival, High Zero, a performance art festival that was kind of large, public art, performance art, and then a poetry and performance festival. And then I also did a series, like a performance series, and I also ran a visual art gallery for about 6, 7 years, I think. And with a very similar kind of emphasis that you had, John, like all of the shows that I was curating with my gallery partner, who was a visual artist, we're really oriented towards bringing a lot of those different threads and the different languages of experimental music, experimental poetry, performance poetry, and visual art sort of into the same space. At the time, the gallery that I ran, Shayla, was also very oriented towards really focusing on people who were not well represented in venues in Baltimore at the time. So folks of color, the queer community, the sort of like fringy, super DIY kind of radical sort of like communities of Baltimore. Um, so part of that like impulse at the time was really to, again, like you were saying, to really like emphasize the fact that there's these commonalities in language across these disciplines. And later on, when I went to grad school and got my MFA, I had a very similar reaction to, again, that sort of disparate relationship between visual artists who would come into my studio and ask me like, is this even music? And I would be like, is that even a sculpture? Like, what are you talking about? Like, how do you not understand the language of this visual media or audio medium when you've got this entire universe of play within your sculptural or painter or installation medium? Um, so yeah, I kind of, that's kind of been my spirit as a, at least on the curatorial and the organizing end, has always been, maybe they would, call it like cabaret or style of like mixing all of this stuff, but I kind of it's always made more sense to pull together the different threads and contextualize different art practices in that way.
That's awesome. Ben?
I think they about covered it.
No doubt.
No, I think one thing, not an add, but more of an amplification, is thinking about when Bonnie's talking about, or when John's saying a hard stop to go to this other formal trajectory or these formal conditions. And then Bonnie's talking about, is that even music? Is that even a sculpture? I think one of the things is that I find in scenes, whatever scene you're in, there's always great people in different scenes. But for many people, there are those hard stops, right? If they're in the noise scene, they're like, oh, well, that's too jazz. And if they're in the jazz scene, that's too, why is it in 4-point? I mean, even listening to Nate William, Vandermark's record yesterday, there's parts of it that, just go through this 50s Jew-free moments where you're like, oh, this is ahistorical in a way, which as soon as I thought of that, I said, oh, this hits a bunch of benchmarks of records that like jazz bows maybe don't talk about as much because they're like, oh, it's a bit like chamber music or something, or it's a bit too loud, or it's a bit too noisy, or it's a bit too performance art. And what I always found is that the limits of those scenes were always very frustrating for me. And I'd never necessarily wanted to create bridges, but I think that when you find people to harmonize in different places, like if you're talking to a poet and you say, hey, do you want to do some liner notes? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, because I rock with you already, right? I'm not necessarily thinking that the conditionality of the media, which is essentially what this is, it's this kind of like media fascism, whether it's like from cassette to CD or from CD to sculpture. That stuff, I personally don't have that framework. I wanna have rules in a framework, but then I forget and someone says, that's not that. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's not. But can I still do it? And they'll say, yeah, because usually there's there are these moments where I think you can bridge things and have a more effortless conversation, essentially about the world and about the world that the art exists in, that's both not canonical to these different forms or media specificity.
You know, my experience is that the most resistance that I see, one way or another, is with audiences. Among artists, for me, my experience has been that one of great discovery that these artists that we are working with are mega fans of this music, for instance. And I mean this music in the kind of biggest, broadest sense, with very little in the way of siloing, of curiosity and engagement, as a kind of consumer fan, and feeling parallels. So I mean, when we started working with Christopher Wool, the painter, American painter. I mean, he was a mega fan of Joe McPhee. He was a mega fan of free jazz and improvised music, and that was a shock to us to realize that, and suddenly realizing that a whole bunch of these artists, that's what they're listening to, that's what they're following, and what they're excited by. To me, that's also an interesting moment, because then that offers the opportunity to say, oh, you're a fan of this artist. Here's what they're listening to. Here's what Charlene von Heil is listening to. She's really interested in this music. If you want to understand her art at any deep level, maybe you should check this out. So it's a little lever into just a way of opening things up. And you can only do what you can do. I mean, I also feel, I've never felt that one should instruct people to listen to one or another kind of music. You want to just open it up. People respond to it, they respond to it, but it's not medicine. Nobody should be forced to take it.
Right.
You know?
So speaking of medicine.
Wow.
Speaking of medicine, look at this little wobbly head. He's
How fresh, Ben? How many days?
8 days. Look at this arm. Knocked out.
July 2nd.
Amazing.
Well, and it reminds me of the thing that you were saying, John, about, I feel like it's Feldman who said, you know, if you really want to have conversation about literature in New York right now, you can't talk to composers, you can only talk to painters. So it's a bit that version of assuming that there's this limit to thinking that doesn't actually exist. Yeah, and who was at the back of the 5 spot every single night? Right? Watching Ornette, watching Monk. It was all painters. Yeah. They were all standing. Lee Krasner, Willem de Kooning, Pollock, all of those folks standing at the back of the room watching them play. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that fascination, because they understand the energy, they understand that there's some kind of a parallel in the way of thinking, not the superficial one, not the action painting kind of idea, but that there's a way, the seriousness, the dedication, that has something in it that relates to what they're working on. And I feel like that, and to me, that's just been incredibly exciting to watch that play that out, you know?
It's interesting to get into a pattern where they're informing each other so much, you know? So I'm gonna move us a little bit to a more kind of charged topic. I think it's really interesting, as you all are, you know, presenters and in so many different capacities, and we're in such a very challenging time, to talk about kind of how you view the financial impacts in the art world, not necessarily within the pandemic or the uprising that's happening now, but in kind of the timeline as it were and as it could be, if you will, and not just you know, the devastation I think all of us feel to not having, you know, the presence of being together.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I got it up until that last part where you said not excluding the current moment.
You guys, I'm just trying to sound real smart right now. No, I think with, it's easy to just talk about all of the monies that's lost, right? Like all the tours that are canceled, all the shows that no longer have openings, all the events that we can no longer have. I think I'm curious if we look at the continuum, this disruption that we're feeling, there are a lot of industries that have already felt, for instance, when you look at historically, the disruption of Airbnb to the hotel industry, like something sprung out and was able to commodify and disrupt an industry. And we're experiencing some very interesting things now, like the ability for all four of us to be together.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious how you're feeling kind of in this midterm moment, with the ability to sustain these projects financially in, the reality of our capitalism. I may not have made that question easier, so I apologize.
Yeah, you're like, let me double down on my earlier statement.
I'm just gonna roll backwards.
One thing I think, just all of my friends who are a bit higher up on the ladder in the art world, a lot of them have projects that are hella on pause, have been pushed back a year, 2 years, pushed back. It's almost like a moratorium, and that we don't know that those things are going to actually come back. But I think, I don't want to be like the person who, like, when Trump got elected, they're like, yeah, punk rock's going to make a comeback. It's like, if this is what we had to do to get like punk back in a certain way, then we'll just have to lose punk too.
Yeah.
But I think that like it'll change a little bit the framework, certainly of the kind of way that we commodify things. Because the fact is that a lot of people who had deals in place, those deals aren't in place. I mean, in the same way that we stay with friends, our house burned down last year, and we're always like, we hope that their family stays in good health. Like, we're good until someone who's like closer to them really needs help. I hope you guys are listening to this right now. Don't kick out. There's a baby. You can't kick out a baby. No,
Think
but
of the baby.
right? Like, what, will you put this baby on the street? But really, I mean, I think that we're going to see a different kind of way where people, I mean, and this happened because I'm involved in the restaurant industry and I'm associated with the James Beard Foundation, and very inside a lot of conversations that happen. Obviously, the restaurant industry was hit very quick and very skillfully by the way that capital routes itself. And in this great op-ed that Gabrielle Hamilton wrote in the Times about prune closing, one of the things she said is that you would see these people who were like, yeah, best quarter ever, we're killing it. And then they're also the first ones to run into the town square with their hair on fire, being like, we need help. And I think I already saw that with just people who I know applied for the USA for Artists $5,000 like relief fund. I mean, Bonnie and I talked about it. I sent it to Bonnie and she was like, I don't know if I'm like in those dire straits, so I'm going to pass, right? But I know people who applied for that who also like are like, oh yeah, I'm killing it. Are you killing it now? Or are you just taking that free $5,000 because no one's really looking, in the same way that no one's looking at a PPP loan? So I don't know what kind. I think we're going to see a real shift in these kind of hierarchical strategies that capital works out in institutions, and I'm hopeful for that. Like, of course, I want the vaccine to come, and I don't want people to have hardship, but these structures that have been in place that are really precarious right now, like rent relief, I don't want to see 2.5 million people go homeless next month, which is the estimate. But I also don't want to get a vaccine at the end of the year and it be like, oh yeah, it's back, but with a super prosthetic that makes the system even stronger, that's allowed to kick people out or is going to, drain off the government, because it's also a scarcity issue. I mean, that's the way commodities work, and commodification is based on scarcity. So there is enough money to actually pay off these people's rent, rather than say, pay off the Ayn Rand Institute, who took whatever, $21 million or whatever it is. So, 2 cents.
Interesting.
In some ways, I
I
think
like it.
from the So from my perspective in the gallery world, what the pandemic has done is accelerate a bunch of processes that were already underway in a certain respect. So for instance, the reliance within mainstream gallery ecosystem on art fairs as a way of advertising and promoting one's artists had gone to a place where it was very difficult to imagine how it could continue to operate that way. It was a rapacious thing that was eating everything, that was excluding anyone who couldn't afford to pony up a really phenomenal amount of money. So it had already created a terrible schism within the art world that does not reflect the actual conditions, does not reflect the actual artwork. And so, but it had also just exhausted the clients, it exhausted everybody. So you had this movable feast that's moving around the globe. Everybody sees one another in all these different exotic locales, goes to these places, spends phenomenal amounts of money, and is thoroughly exhausted and boring at a certain level, right? Like, so the artwork starts to be something routine. And this, just shutting that completely down, has taken a whole bunch of hypotheticals that everyone was putting out there. Like, I wonder what it would be like if there were no art fairs. People were sort of thinking that to themselves and maybe whispering it to their friends, and suddenly said, let's impose that moratorium and see what it would be like. And now people are sort of realizing, well, what would it be like with a very different structure, with the whole thing reorganized in an interesting way? I think this situation is accelerating a whole bunch of those kinds of processes. That's just one. And I don't think it means that art fairs are never going to be there anymore, but it's going to change the scene. And it's going to also, in some ways, democratize the scene, because nobody except the absolute mega galleries are going to be able to afford to spend $100,000 to go do Art Basel. You know, what it takes to do that, and in terms of when it gets back to the actual artwork, what pressure that puts on the artwork to perform at a certain level, it can't do that anymore. And so I think the whole infrastructure is really going to have to shift, and it'll shift in a really interesting way. And in some ways, it'll be a little more parallel with the kind of gig economy that a lot of experimental and improvising musicians have had to face for many, many years. You know, I think that's my assessment of it, is that it's a really interesting moment. It's a very fraught moment, but it's a very interesting moment in terms of that acceleration of a process already underway.
Yeah, I can add to that, because there's this, when you're talking about democratization that leads to like a sort of like or flattening the hierarchies between like certain like well-to-do galleries and all the other folks that fall underneath. But then to have that be analogous to this gig economy space, which in one hand holds like all the flexibility that we as musicians know gig economies have. You can kind of like move in and out, you can kind of structure your own work, you can kind of move your own schedule, you can sort of work in a way that's a little bit more fluid and a little more dynamic. But on the other hand, that got me thinking about this thing that I was recently considering when I was having some conversation with an arts funding organization, specifically about Baltimore. But my thing about being in Baltimore for so long is always about like sustainability. Like, what are we doing? What is any organization doing that's going to actually like have some make a demonstrable difference across time? Because Baltimore doesn't need a flash in the pan. I mean, that city needs real deep sort of sustained change. But the one thing that did come up was exactly this question about like wages, right? Like setting some kind of baselines for how artists get paid. I mean, I know that's something in the visual art world that those like organizations like Wage have been actually that New York based organization have addressed, which is that, you know, so many artists are often, especially visual artists, are often asked to do work for free. You know, they're going to have a show at a gallery. It's all for your career. You set up everything, you do everything, you get unpaid for most of it. Musicians don't face that same amount, but the differences between how musicians get paid are pretty vastly different along the spectrum. And when musicians go to universities or other like sort of lecture or those types of gigs, that is also really vastly different from like, you know, getting paid $150 for like 3 days of workshops to, you know, when they do the Robert Ashley at Bennington for $50,000 or something. Sorry to use Bennington, but where was it? It was at Bard maybe.
I think it was at
Anyway.
Brown.
Oh, was it? No, you might be right.
But we're gonna have an Ivy fight right now.
I don't know. I'm Brown's my alum. So.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm outnumbered.
Outnumbered. But I guess the question that came up for me is like, what I hope to have happen is that there's an opportunity now to kind of recalibrate like that particular system of how artists are supported, knowing that at least the sort of more ethical arts organizations are knowing that a lot of artists are struggling, like obviously, especially musicians. It's like all of our work just disappears. And it doesn't matter how cool it is that Zoom can connect you across the world. Like Zoom sucks as a medium for live music. And yes, I will be playing a show later this weekend where I will perform using Zoom. But come on, we all know that Zoom is not quite there as a technological medium for the experience of live music. And not to mention that improvisation, which is not just the sound, obviously, it's the other person's like vibrations, like actually interplaying with your physical being. So when that's gone, it's hard. So telepresence is not quite where where it can be to make that really palpable. But I'm hoping that in this particular moment, when people realize that musicians and other artists do have a certain level of struggle, projects are canceled or stalled for probably never going to come back. I don't know. Maybe there's a chance to like correct this consistent undervaluing, and also this like consistent like sort of like privileged access to a lot of like art spaces, right? Because obviously, if you can afford to work for $100 for 3 days of workshops, that's something, because that's a lot of work and that's not enough money to live off of. Which is kind of what I had posed to this arts funding organization, which is instead of asking the artist to tell you how much money they need, why don't you just set a standard for how much artists should be paid for their time? And then you ask the artist how much time and how much materials you think it will take. And then you pay them a rate, which is probably a little bit closer to what the Wage folks are trying to do. And so I recommend you check that out for folks who don't know about them. I think it's a pretty radical way of approaching art labor that I just find really interesting.
And also I think the amazing thing that Wage does is they don't hide the math. They don't ignore the math. I mean, that's the math about sustainability. It's always nice to do the $500 talk or the $1,000 artist presentation, but you're presenting your work that you lost tens of thousands of dollars on, and being like, I did this amazing thing at this museum and this thing at this gallery, and
look what I can do for $500.
Yeah,
I can make a whole solo show for just under $2,500.
Yeah, well, you're smarter than I am.
I know. It cost more than that, but. I guess that's the point. Maybe that's the point. It's like maybe we can really like be a lot more transparent about that, and maybe something will happen so that we understand really what like let's talk about. Maybe we can talk about the money a little bit more, so we can really see what that is for people.
I mean, if you're going to talk about the visual arts side of it, a very significant piece of the pie would be that visual artists in the United States should lobby very hard for a parallel to the music world's notion of residuals.
Right.
The fact that an artwork is sold, and the only place in the United States that you basically get any money on an ongoing basis, if it's resold and resold and resold, is California. If you're a California artist, and if the people who buy it and who sell it actually conform to the law, that's leaving a lot of ifs for a situation that should be much more regulated, and where when it's resold for a fabulous profit, the artist should be able to get at least a small cut of that.
Right.
That's the ethical thing to do. That's a reasonable thing to do. And that would be a lot more, in many cases, a lot more than $500. That would be, you know, when people's careers take that upper, like that rocket ship, those people, you know, often don't get a lot of what they have made. And so I think that would be, from my standpoint, a really significant thing. And, you know, I think artists should be advocating for that. Visual artists should be advocating for that, because that's something we could learn from the music world. Not that necessarily, for instance, improvising musicians or experimental musicians are making enormous amounts of money on residuals from their recordings, but at least the legal precedent and the framework is there for something that, like, I own that and I control that. I should own that and I should control that. And the only thing that an artist really owns and controls when it goes out into the world is the image itself. So, you know, so those are things I think, those are, from a financial standpoint, I definitely think those are things that need to be, and if we're talking Turkey about the money, it would be really useful for folks to have that, to be fighting for that, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's an interesting concept. We're getting pretty close to the end of our time, so I'm going to selfishly try to leave us with a little bit of positivity, because it has been, just about 130 days of solitude for me. So I'm going to start with you, Ben, because I think you've got a lot of hope and promise right there in your hands. We're at halfway in this year. What is something that you are looking forward to?
That's a tough one. I mean, this thing didn't change my life all that much, because of the way that I had already thought about things. I certainly missed connection, and many of the friends that I've talked to miss connection, but we don't live in an intentional community, but we live with very close friends who also have an 8-month-old and love dogs, and we have a big garden, and we're able to really, I think, focus on that. I miss seeing things. I miss seeing art and kind of getting my mind blown, but it's also like, for me, it's been an incredibly restorative chance to do those things that I haven't been able, you know, I haven't had a chance to do. I mean, I'm looking at like my little bookshelf in front of me, which is not the only bookshelf in the house, but it's like, I haven't had a chance to read the Robin Kelly Monk book. And now I have time to do that. And I think my ideas have been shifting in a way that they hadn't shifted before, principally because social media, going to gigs, seeing people, going to art show, install. I am very grateful for the pause. But I'm also in a condition where I get to be with my family. I get to be with my close friends every day. And I understand and respect that. I mean, for instance, our Aunt Tiwi, she doesn't get to see anybody. You know, she has to go to her job at the church, and when the church is closed and that kind of thing, where you see people wanting to have that public interaction. I don't want to go so far as to say it's a time of healing. But I think there is an opportunity in this time to heal. And so that's what I've been trying to remind myself, and also remind friends and family, that this is a restorative time, partially because we can't say, oh, I have to be at work. You know, my shift starts at 9. Those are the parameters. It's like, okay, you don't have any money, but you did get your time back that you would never, you know, you can't go to the Applebee's, work a 10-hour shift, take the money that you made at Applebee's and go buy that time back. That's always been really critical for me, especially since I've spent my life in the restaurant industry. Always a real huge fucking bummer. So to have this time, I think, is like just to remember about restoring, and not an achievement outcome oriented thing, but for people to do some of those things that they haven't had the opportunity to do with their life, that now's your chance, whatever it is. So that's my hope, is the restorative nature of this moment.
That's wonderful. Bonnie, how about you? What are you looking forward to for the rest of this year?
I definitely, that's the same word that I was going to use, which is that this is a restorative period. You got it, Ben. I actually just moved to Providence because I'm going to start this PhD program.
Dr. Jones.
Dr. Bonnie
Oh, man.
Jones.
Very nice.
if
Congrats.
I make it. But that's sort of what my thing on the horizon is, which I'm very excited for. The timing was kind of crazy, obviously. I left Baltimore, which is a city that I have been in for 20 years, so basically half my life, where, as we learned from this Zoom panel, I've done a lot of things and was really involved there. So part of my leaving and starting this new thing is also layered with just processing this midpoint in my life and where I've come from and what I've done. And so some of that is this, restorative kind of looking through the past and moving through whatever this question mark of the future is, which, and in a lot of ways, and it might be, maybe it's not cheesy, but basically, we're improvisers. Like, this is like the skill that we've been building our entire careers, which is this ability to negotiate and move through a lot of different levels and layers of density and complexity and simplicity, and just kind of negotiate that. So I feel prepared in that way. So so I can be excited, even though it's a lot of, there's a lot of uncertainty. So yeah, I guess I'm looking forward to even though this is probably not how most people think of starting a PhD program, I think I'm going to approach it as a healing and restorative process. I would like this
Beautiful.
thing to heal me a little bit from some things. I think that would be great.
That's awesome. Okay, John, how about you? What are you looking forward to?
Well, this hasn't really been a pause for me in a lot of ways. I feel like I understand what you're saying about improvising, because I feel like we've been constantly reinventing what we're doing or the ways that we're doing everything for the last little while. And a lot of the things that we're doing are very unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Like doing things virtually are very uncomfortable for all of us, I know, in these communities, but they're very uncomfortable for us as people who basically present stuff in space. And so figuring out how to do that has been a real uphill battle for us. And I feel like we finally got to a place where we're understanding how to do it, and now we're doing it. So we've got so I'm really excited about the programming we've got planned for the upcoming, the gallery's got planned for the upcoming period, including the online exhibitions that we're working on. We just launched one yesterday called Carl Wortham Sketchbook 1966. And we've got one coming up, which will be a conversation between Joe McPhee and Colleen Smith about the sort of premised on the 50th anniversary of Nation Time, which is coming up in December.
Wow.
And talking about what Nation Time means now, and the conversation that we had. That's what it means right there. That's the conversation we had that will be the backbone of that, was just so unbelievably inspiring. I walked away from it just really moved and really deeply thankful for thoughtful people and caring and loving people in our lives. And so I'm looking forward to those things, you know, those kinds of tangible things that we put out into the world that we believe in. We have 9 CDs that we have just finished that went on hold in the middle of all of this because the covers were finished and the CDs hadn't been printed yet. So we're about to put out Milford Graves, Don Pullen's complete Yale concert, 1966, which is one of the absolute cornerstone masterpieces of contemporary improvised music, and a whole group of things. Instant Composers Pool, really early Instant Composers Pools, 2 CDs of never released material from 1966 to 1972. Joe McPhee music, 2 CD set of never released material from 1969 and 1970, all recorded in 3 different contexts in the Hudson Valley. Couple of FMP records that have never been out, an Alex Schlippenbach record and Peter Kowald record that's never been on CD before. So these are things we've been working on and they just went on hold and now they're about to come out and they're coming out end of this month. So hang on to your hats.
Amazing.
But those things, I'm so excited about them because that's, to me, it's an exchange and it's been so exciting watching everybody do the same thing. Carrying through on and learning new ways to do the things that they've been doing. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Well, that sounds great. I'm actually very excited about all of those things. And I asked just selfishly to find out what was going on. I want to thank all 3 of you again for doing this panel with me today.
There's
and thank
4 of us.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'd like to thank all 4 of you. I'm so sorry. I want to thank Ken and Sam and all the folks at Catalytic too for doing this panel today. And just remind you, it's 7 p.m. Central tonight. The program starts up again with Sylvie Cavassier, followed by Brandon Lopez, then Nate Woolley and Kate Morey, and ending with Fred Longberholm and Joe McPhee. Gonna be a good one. See you later.
Thanks,
Bye,
Kim.
everybody.